Hey you guys, welcome back to the salon and happy holidays. This year is kind of a little Christmas special edition that I'm doing. So, between 1971 and 1978, the BBC in the UK obviously had a quite delightful tradition of broadcasting a short film based on a classic ghost story, mostly a classic ghost story, every year right around Christmas time. Now, the original annual run of the series consisted of 8 episodes. 5 of those were based on stories by M.R. James. 7 of them were directed by Lawrence Gordon Clark, and all of them were recently added to Shudder. So, man, I can't tell you how excited I was when I saw that they had added all of those because I don't think that I had ever seen any of these previously, and I had heard about it, so I was like really eager to check them out. So, in the spirit of the holiday season, let's kind of tackle each short film in order that they were broadcast, and we'll see if my excitement was warranted. So, the first installment of the series, broadcast in 1971, was based on M.R. James's 1911 short story, The Stalls of Barchester Cathedral. Now, the TV version actually adds a frame story set in the 1930s that wasn't present in the original story. I'm not really sure if this edition adds anything to the narrative plot-wise, but it doesn't really detract from it either, so I wasn't really bothered by the change. That said, I'm going to say, even though this is a good classic ghost story, in the British tradition, it's also a little bit kind of staid and a little bit slow moving. And the twist, if it could be called that, will probably be pretty obvious to modern audiences. So in 1932, we have a scholar named Dr. Black, and he's hard at work cataloging the library at the titular Barchester Cathedral, which I don't think is a real cathedral. It's like a fictional one. So the librarian remembers this trunk that has been stashed away somewhere that's never been opened. It belonged to this former archdeacon named Dr. Haynes, who died 50 years earlier under mysterious circumstances. So Dr. Black agrees to go through all the stuff in the trunk and let the librarian know if anything interesting is in there. He finds Dr. Haynes's diary, which is certainly interesting, and at that point we go into a flashback. So 50 years before, Dr. Haynes moved to Barchester along with his sister Letitia, with the implied expectation that he'll be taking on the role of archdeacon after the current one, who is this stubborn old coot named Dr. Pulteney, is I think how you pronounce his last name, when he finally kicks the bucket. Unfortunately, though, Dr. Pulteney doesn't really seem to be any hurry to pop his clogs. He's still chugging along at the ripe old age of 90. So a couple of years go by, the dude's like 92 now and really doesn't show any signs of slowing down. So it's clear that Dr. Haynes, who has moved here to take this position, is getting a little bit impatient for this withered old fossil to keel over already. But fortuitously, it so happens that the poor old man stumbles down a staircase one day in his residence and plummets to his death. Gosh, what a dirty shame that is. Now, Letitia, the sister, she actually blames the maid for not noticing that a stair rod was missing because the guy apparently slipped down the stairs. But still, from all the surreptitious glancing going on, it's pretty obvious that Dr. Haynes and the maid kind of conspired to bump Dr. Pulteney off, and make it look like an accident. Now, despite his guilt, Dr. Haynes is still kind of a sanctimonious bastard about it, and he's very quick to admonish others for speaking about the poor old man. It's he was such a great man and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, oh, shut up, you killed him, stop it. Or he really doesn't like that some people would be like, oh, lucky for you, and he's like, you shut up, you know what I mean? Even though he's totally the killer. Soon enough, though, kind of weird shit starts happening around the archdeacon's residence. Dr. Haynes starts to have trouble sleeping, and he sometimes hears voices in the house, or keeps catching glimpses of this adorable, fluffy black cat that nobody else ever seems to see. And, the staff are like, we don't have a cat. We don't know what you're talking about. He also becomes kind of obsessed with these strange wood carvings. They're like little mini statues, kind of. And they're on his stall in the cathedral where he sits, to do his pontificating or whatever. One of the carvings is a cat, and one of them is a Grim Reaper with a noose kind of situation. Now, on one occasion, he's kind of resting his hand on the cat, during chapel or whatever, and he's pretty sure that it turns into, living fur momentarily. So Dr. Haynes, he thinks that these carvings are kind of weird. It's not usually something you would see in a church, you know what I mean? So he asks, this local expert about them, And he's told that they were made by this local man whose name was Austin the Twiceborn, or that's what they called him anyway. And he was supposedly like psychic, or he had, premonitions or whatever. And what's more, he says, the wood that they were carved from was taken from an area of the forest nearby where some kind of witchcrafty shenanigans went on, and in particular from this huge felled tree, which was once called the Hanging Oak. Now, where this tree was cut, the expert says human bones were found kind of among the roots. Now, as the story goes on, the ghostly manifestations kind of become more acute, and Dr. Haynes starts to see what looks like kind of a cloaked figure sort of skulking around in the shadows. And at one point, another man in the cathedral tells Dr. Haynes that he saw someone standing next to him when Dr. Haynes was like pretty sure he was alone and there was nobody standing there. Now, eventually, this hooded figure, which you're led to assume is like the living version of the carved Grim Reaper, because there's a living version of the kitty cat too, he kind of shoves Dr. Haynes's murdering ass down the same stairs as the previous archdeacon died on. A delicious piece of poetic justice there. Now, not only does the fall break the dude's neck, but the ghost also somehow kind of slashes up his face, so much so that they say he's unrecognizable. It doesn't really look that bad in the visual, but like later they say, oh, he was unrecognizable. So authorities at the time were like, we can't figure out how that might have happened. Back in the quote-unquote present day of 1932, the scholar, Dr. Black, becomes kind of curious about this cathedral, but when he visits it, the two described carvings, the little statues, are no longer there because the stall has been renovated at some point, like in the last 5 decades. So he goes to this antiquarian type dude who supposedly like knows all the local history. And that guy says, well, one of the figures got brought into the archive, but it was broken in half. And inside the broken statue was a letter, which was written by Austin the Twiceborn, like the supposedly psychic guy who carved these. And the letter in there, he essentially like prophesied that anyone who touched the figure with quote unquote blood on his hands was in for a bad time, which obviously that's kind of what happened. So Dr. Black actually asks where this carving is now, and the antiquarian says, oh, well, the guy who owned it, like, it scared his kids, so he burned it. So yeah, this was a pretty decent, like, kind of middling ghost story. It had some creepy bits, but I kind of feel like it might be a little bit too stuffy and maybe a little bit boring for modern viewers. But if you like kind of old school gothic ghost stories and don't mind a sort of ponderous pace, then it's definitely worth watching, and it's a good adaptation of the story. So the next episode is A Warning to the Curious from 1972, and this one was actually much better and is, still generally considered one of the best of the original run. So this was based on the M.R. James story from 1925. Now this adaptation, again, takes a couple of liberties with the structure, making it kind of more straightforward and chronological rather than told secondhand in flashback like the original story is, and also changes up the characterization. It actually changes the main character from a younger man who finds the fateful item by accident to an older man who's looking for it on purpose. And they also add in the character of Dr. Black from the previous Stalls of Barchester episode, played by the same actor, Clive Swift. Now, personally, I think these were wise alterations. The story plays out in a much more direct, focused way. And I liked that with the appearance of Dr. Black from the last episode, they were almost kind of trying to make the story seem like part of the extended M.R. James universe. So at the beginning of the story, there's a bit of a prelude, which takes place about, I think it's 12 years prior to the events of the main narrative. So there's an unnamed archaeologist, and he's quite enthusiastically, digging a hole in this kind of remote area of woodland. Now, soon enough, a sinister-looking man appears kind of at the lip of the hole, what the fuck are you doing? And he's yelling that it's hey, nobody's allowed to dig there. So the archaeologist gets real, upset about it, and he's kind of harumphing. He's like, hey, I got permission from the landlord, I can do this, piss off or whatever. But the newcomer is very, very insistent. You can't dig here. You can't dig here. There's a bit of a scuffle. The archaeologist actually knocks the dude down, and then the sinister dude goes and grabs a convenient bill hook that's kind of stuck in this log nearby and hacks the archaeologist to death. So we then jump ahead 12 years and kind of get into the story proper. So our main character is named Mr. Paxton, and he's kind of down on his luck. He's just lost his job in London, and he's really not hopeful of getting another one because it's during the Great Depression. So he's always been interested in archaeology, And he decides, well, he doesn't really have anything else going on, so he's just going to kind of throw caution to the wind and use what little money he has to take this trip out to this fictional town called Seaborough in East Anglia. Now, he became really interested about this sort of legend kind of situation about 3 crowns dating from, I think, the Dark Ages that supposedly protect East Anglia from invasion. And he is bound and determined to kind of make his fortune or make his name by finding the last crown that is supposedly still hidden in the area. So once he gets to Seaborough, he gets set up in an inn and starts kind of wandering around, seeing what he can see. Now, the local vicar tells him that according to the townsfolk, the Ager family were actually the ones kind of tasked with protecting the last crown. But William Ager was the last of the line. He didn't have any heirs, and he died of consumption 12 years ago, like fairly young. I think he was only in his 30s or something. Like, Paxton even sees the dude's grave in the local churchyard. Now, while Paxton is kind of strolling through this it looks like it's sort of a deserted village, but I guess people live there. But he thinks he sees like the figure of a man up ahead, like turning a corner ahead of him. So when Paxton catches up, though, there's nobody there. But then suddenly this dog runs out of this house and starts like attacking his sleeve, essentially. So this woman comes out, and she's actually quite friendly, and she comes out and pulls the dog off, and she's like, man, I'm so sorry, like that dog has never done that ever. So Paxton and the woman kind of get to talking. And it comes to pass that William Ager used to live in this very house where the woman lives now. And also that she sometimes sees this kind of hobo-looking dude roaming around in the woods, like way across the way. Now, at this point, it's implied, I think, I'm not sure, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that Paxton believes that William Ager might still be alive. Because in spite of the gravestone, there's a scene of him like looking in what I assume is like the church ledger, and he has like a birth date, like William Ager has a birth date in there, but no death date. So he's like, maybe that dude's still alive, and they just put a fake gravestone there. But like I said, I might be totally misreading that, but that's kind of how I took it. So Paxton theorizes that the hobo-looking dude that this woman keeps seeing must be William, and the spot where he's lurking around must be where the crown is buried, which, that's some pretty top-notch deductive reasoning there. So the next day, Paxton actually lies to the innkeeper, who's kind of suspicious about his motives and sees his books and stuff. And he's like, I think he's here looking for that crown. You know what I mean? Like, we should just leave that where it is. So he actually has to lie to the dude. And he says, I have to go back to London. Like, if I had an emergency or something like that, I'll be back tomorrow or whatever. But really, he's going out to where the crown is hidden, obviously. So he goes out there and he's digging for like hours, like well into the night. But he eventually unearths a skeleton, presumably belonging to the former archaeologist who got hacked to death, and then he discovers the famed crown itself. Now, he thinks that he sees like a dark figure kind of disappearing into the trees as he's kind of peering up over the edge of the hole that he made. But he still decides to kind of abscond with his find. So he kind of wraps it up in this blanket and stuffs it in his backpack and gets the fuck out of there. Now, as he's walking the path, like back to the train station, he encounters this sort of stoic local who is holding a billhook, nice little thing there. And he asks him, it's like, hey, what you up to? You just like walking or something like that? Yeah, totally just walking. I'm just going to the train station, man. Like, chill out. You know what I mean? The local then turns to look at him, like as he's retreating, and sees another figure following close behind him that Paxton apparently does not see. And the same thing happens when Paxton gets on the train. Like, the porter acts like somebody else was getting on behind Paxton, like, oh, watch your step, sir. And then he's like, oh, wait, nobody's there. Duh, what am I thinking? You know what I mean? So, very mysterious. So Paxton keeps seeing this figure in the distance and kind of feeling a presence around him, like, all the time. So he finally confides in Dr. Black, the scholar, who's also staying at the inn with him. Like I said, this is a character that is not in the original story, but he was in the last story, so they were kind of trying to make a continuity, I guess. So Paxton shows Dr. Black the crown, and Dr. Black is like really impressed. He's like, wow, you actually found it. I thought it was just a legend or whatever. And he's like, what are you going to do with this magnificent find that you made? Paxton says, I'm going to march right back up to that wooded area and put this damn thing right back in the ground where I found it, because ever since I touched this, I haven't felt alone for a single second. And I guess at this point, he has become convinced that William Ager's ghost is indeed the one that's kind of hovering around him. So there's actually a great, really creepy scene, like later that night. And Paxton like wakes up in his room, or he's in his room, and it's really dark in there. And he hears like breathing or something, and the lights go out. And then he gets his flashlight and kind of shines it around. And then he just catches the edge of this really creepy, like hunched over figure on the floor. And you can only see like the side of this really, really pale face. So Paxton like screams his fucking head off, as you would. And then Dr. Black and the innkeeper come to help him. And he says Ager was just in his room, like presumably to take the crown back. So Dr. Black actually accompanies Paxton back to the spot in the woods. And true to his word, Paxton reburies the crown, hoping that all is forgiven. So the two men then return to the inn and everything seemingly goes back to normal. But not so fast. The following morning, the innkeeper is outside, like shining shoes or whatever, and then he sees Dr. Black kind of across the way, like calling for Paxton so they can go out for a walk. Now Paxton comes out and the two men kind of amble off. But only like a minute later, Dr. Black reappears like out of Paxton's room and asks the innkeeper, hey, where's Paxton? We were supposed to go for a walk. So the innkeeper is like completely befuddled. He's like, you were just here like 5 seconds ago and you called him and y'all went out for a walk. And then Dr. Black is like, oh shit, that was not me. And so he runs off, like presuming that that was the ghost. So he kind of runs off to find Paxton. So he sees Paxton like way far ahead being chased by this dark figure. And he tries to catch up, but he can't quite manage it. So by the time that he finds Paxton, like at the spot where, you know, the crown was, the poor old chap has been hacked to death with a billhook, just like the original hapless archaeologist. So, you know, Ghost William Ager, kind of a dick. I mean, Paxton did bring your stupid crown back, bro. So, you know, maybe just chill out. So yeah, this was actually a really good installment. It was very spooky, very mysterious, and the lead character of Paxton was actually really sympathetic. There weren't really any surprises. You knew pretty much what was going to happen, like as soon as Paxton swiped the crown out of the ground. But I think that the execution of the story was so effective that it didn't really matter. So I thought this one was actually really solid. So Lost Hearts was broadcast in 1973. Now, this was based on a story that was first published in 1895, and this has actually always been one of my very favorite M.R. James stories, and this was really an excellent adaptation of it. Now, even though this one is only about 35 minutes long, I mean, it has spookiness for days, and it has a surprisingly gruesome concept on top of that. So we're following an orphan named Stephen. And he arrives at the beginning at the kind of sprawling country mansion of his much older distant cousin, whose name is Mr. Abney. Now, rounding out this household, you also have kind of the grandmotherly housekeeper, whose name is Mrs. Bunch, and the kind of surly but good-hearted butler, valet, groundskeeper guy, whose name is Parks. So Mr. Abney seems like a delightful old chap. He's clearly very enthusiastic about his young cousin's arrival. And he seems particularly excited that Stephen is turning 12 soon, specifically on Halloween. Now, Stephen finds this fixation with his birth date a little weird, but Parks claims that Mr. Abney is a scholar and he's just like really excited by small details, so don't think too much about it. Now, things appear normal at first, as they usually do in these kind of stories, but astute viewers will be put on their guard by Mr. Abney kind of talking with his cousin about immortality, Simon Magus, that kind of stuff. So that suggests that he's pretty well versed in ancient magic, alchemy, that kind of stuff. Now, Stephen asks if there are any more kids around, because this is kind of an isolated house, right? Now, Mr. Abney says, well, there were a couple kids staying at the house a couple years ago, but they're gone now. Now, one day, while Stephen is out exploring the grounds, he sees what appears to be another boy kind of running and disappearing around a column. And then when he's climbing a tree later on, he sees a girl that kind of like vanishes after a minute. Now, Stephen also spots these same two kids like looking out of an upstairs window of the house, and later hears kids laughing and whispering when he's kind of out on the grounds flying a kite. Now, Mrs. Bunch, the housekeeper, she tells him, like pretty much unprompted, that Mr. Abney had taken in a girl named Phoebe, who he'd found while he was out walking like several years ago. Presumably she was like an orphan or something like that. Now, Mrs. Bunch said that she was a gypsy and that she took off one morning like before anyone was awake. Like she stayed there for a while and then one morning they woke up and she was gone. So they thought she ran away. So then Mrs. Bunch says, oh, well, the same thing happened with this other kid this other orphan that Mr. Abney came across, this was an Italian kid named Giovanni, who kind of likewise stayed for a bit and then supposedly ran away. But Stephen thinks it's a little bit weird because this kid left his most prized possession, which was like a really nice hurdy-gurdy, and he left it behind at the house. So the next day, Parks gets mad and blames Stephen for leaving these really deep scratches in the wood paneling in the hallway. And Stephen insists, hey man, I didn't do that or whatever. And Mr. Abney actually believes him. He's like, don't worry about it, Now that night, Stephen gets woke up by this boy playing a hurdy-gurdy next to his bed. And the music seems to like hypnotize him. So it kind of like lures him out of his room and down the hall. And then he looks into this other room and he sees the girl that he saw before like sitting in a bathtub. Now the kids, they kind of move their hands aside. Their hands have these really, really long nails on them. And they move their hands aside and both their chests have been torn open. Like you can see the ribs and you could see that their hearts are missing. Like, I'm not really sure what the significance of the kids having super long press-on nails is, but I guess it kind of explains the scratches in the woodwork, so that's that mystery solved. Now, Stephen, understandably, freaks the fuck out at seeing this and screams at the top of his lungs. Now, Mr. Abney and Mrs. Bunch find him kind of cowering in the hall, and they try to convince him that, of course, it was just a nightmare. Now, we, as the audience, know this is not true, though, because Abney goes into the room where Stephen saw the kids, picks up the broken hurdy-gurdy from the floor that he previously told Stephen was not in there, and kind of goes and surreptitiously burns it in the fireplace. Not long after that, Stephen actually overhears Parks telling Mrs. Bunch that he heard voices down in the cellar that kind of like scared the crap out of him. And then Stephen comes in and says, hey, I've heard voices too, like when I was out flying my kite or whatever. But then both Parks and Mrs. Bunch kind of try to laugh the whole thing off. Oh, it's so silly. It was nothing, really. Meanwhile, it's the eve of Halloween, which is Stephen's birthday, his 12th birthday. And Abney kind of insists that Stephen come down to his study at exactly midnight so he can tell him his fortune, which that will be Abney's birthday present to him. Stephen thinks this is a little strange, but he's like, well, no, it sounds kind of cool because he knows that, the dude is kind of into magical stuff or whatever. So he's like, all right, whatever. Mrs. Bunch kind of makes him a cake. It's a whole nice little birthday thing. As you might have surmised, though, Abney has ill intentions for his little cousin. Because as soon as Stephen comes into his study for his fortune, Abney gives him a glass of drugged port and, renders the kid unconscious. And then Abney grabs a knife and is going to cut the kid's heart out because it turns out that he only needs one more to get immortality. You need 3 hearts, see, 3 kids' hearts, and this is the 3rd one. So he's like super jacked that he's like finally getting the 3rd one. So he's going to cut the kid's heart out. Luckily for Stephen, however, the ghosts, who are obviously Phoebe and Giovanni, who had their hearts removed previously, they kind of show up and they put Abney under some kind of spell, like using the music of the hurdy-gurdy like he did before, and then kind of stabbing him with his own knife or making him stab himself. I can't remember exactly. So there's kind of a brief wrap-up at the old man's funeral where the vicar is, quite amusingly, trying to be diplomatic, I guess, about the weird-ass way this dude died and kind of all the scandalous occult shit that they found in his study. So then Stephen kind of glances over and sees Phoebe and Giovanni, the ghosts, at the edge of the churchyard, like kind of waving to him, and then they kind of turn and like frolic off into the distance. So, unlike the asshole ghost, William Ager, in the last installment, these ghosts actually, did our protagonist a solid here by preventing him from getting his heart scooped out. So a creepy old dude could live forever. So, good show, Spectral Kids. Yeah, this was a great installment. Like I said, this is one of my favorite stories of his, so I was glad to see that this adaptation was so good. It's kind of short, but sweet, very well paced. The character of Mr. Abney in particular was really intriguing because he didn't really seem sinister at all in the beginning. Even though you knew it's a horror story, so he's probably up to some like hanky shenanigans. You just don't know exactly what, but he seems so nice, you know what I mean? And some of the shots of the ghost kids were legit creepy. And I was actually kind of shocked by the glimpses of the kid's heartless chest. I mean, it was very, very brief. It was just like a second or something. I mean, it's not graphic by today's standards, but for early 70s TV, it was pretty grisly, I thought. But yeah, I mean, I think that this is the best installment of the original series so far. So The Treasure of Abbot Thomas from 1974. This was another decent adaptation of another story from 1904. This one actually, I think, takes more liberties with the source material than most of the others. For example, the setting is moved from Germany in the original story to England. I mean, obviously that was done for budgetary reasons. The narrative is told in a linear fashion rather than in flashback, as the original story is. One major character is removed from the original story and another is added in that wasn't in it. And there's a whole kind of minor subplot that wasn't in the original story either. On the whole, these seem to have been like smart alterations, I thought, though I will admit that the addition of the subplot seemed a little bit random because it doesn't really have that much to do with the main story. So we open on a seance, which is always a promising setup in my opinion. So we have Lady Datterling, and she has lost her husband at some point in the recent past, and she's been desperate to contact him. So to that end, she has enlisted the services of a pair of married mediums, Mr. and Mrs. Tyson, who she lets them like live on the estate, like, you know, in one of the properties or whatever, in exchange for these kind of nightly sessions where she believes that she's receiving messages from her deceased husband. Now, it's obvious that these two are total frauds, but Lady Datterling is so kind of starved for connection that she'll kind of believe anything, you know what I mean? Now, she has a son who's about college age, and his name is Peter, Lord Datterling. And he's just kind of exasperated by the whole situation. Like, he wishes that his mother would just get on with her life and stop entertaining all of this nonsense. Also at issue is the fact that she apparently won't allow Peter to, quote unquote, replace his father, which, ew. Like, you know what I mean? I mean, I get what he means. Like, I get that he means that she's not letting him take over fully as the new lord, you know, as is his aristocratic birthright or whatever. But the way he words it kind of sounds like a little bit weird and incesty. Moving on. So Peter's mentor and tutor at the college that he's at is this kind of kindly older clergyman named Reverend Justin Somerton. And the two of them have this very close, like, kind of father-son relationship. Now, Peter asks Justin to come to his house for tea and to attend one of his mother's seances. Now, he's kind of hoping that Justin's rather calm rationality and his status as a man of the cloth might disabuse his mother of her fanciful notions, let's call it that. Now, Justin is actually kind of amused by the prospect. He's very skeptical, and he really enjoys, like, knocking the legs out from beneath charlatans. So he's like, yeah, I'll totally come. So at the seance, Justin pretty much goes in for the kill, like, almost immediately. Like, Mrs. Tyson starts, like, you know, getting into her zone or whatever, and her spirit guide is supposedly a 15th century clergyman. So Justin starts asking him exactly when he died, and then he starts talking to him in Latin and Norman French, which a man of his rank and of his era would have been able to understand. So naturally, the spirit kind of tries to deflect, you know, when he asks him, like, when he died, oh, time and death are meaningless, man, and blah, blah, blah. And then whenever he's asked a question in anything other than English, he just, like, completely clams up, you know what I'm saying? So then finally, in a quite dramatic display, Justin kind of comes up behind Mr. Tyson and is like, oh, I think you have a frog in your throat or something like that, and then whacks him on the back. And this causes him to, like, cough up this synthesizer doodad that he'd been using, like, to do the quote-unquote spirit voice. So Lady Datterling is obviously devastated by finding out that these two idiots are complete fakes, so she just sends them packing the very next morning. Now, note that this entire sequence with these mediums and stuff like that, this is not in the original story at all, and has very little connection to the events that follow. I'm assuming that it was just added in here in order to demonstrate that Justin, even though he's a clergyman, is a rationalist who doesn't really buy into all this supernatural codswallop or whatever. I will also note that Peter, who is kind of one of the main characters, is a film-only character. In the original story, Justin is telling the tale of his lone hunt for this titular treasure to another party after the fact. So Peter is not in the original story at all. So anyway, we now get into kind of the main part of the narrative that is based on the original story. So Justin is kind of fascinated by this 15th century churchman who was at this same place where he is, whose name was Abbot Thomas, obviously from the title. And the legend says that this dude was carried off by the devil in 1429. Now, Abbot Thomas was apparently not a good dude, hence why he was carried off by the devil. He was also an alchemist, and there have been long time stories that he had this massive cache of gold that he had made with his alchemy powers, and he stashed it somewhere in the vicinity, and no one has been able to find it in all this time. Now, Justin thinks this whole story is hogwash. He's like, it's just a legend. It's not real. But Peter's interest is kind of piqued, like, as he reads more about this mysterious dude. Now, once Peter figures out that this passage in the abbot's writings refers to a specific abbey, which are on the grounds of this college church situation, he becomes obsessed with figuring out where the gold is hidden. Now, Justin kind of poo-poos this whole situation. He's just like, my ass might get shit canned if they think that I just came here like looking for this treasure. But Peter is just so enthusiastic and driven about this. And Justin has to admit he is kind of curious, like to see if these clues lead to anything. So eventually his resolve is broken down and they start looking for shit. So the bulk of the story then is Peter and Justin trying to figure out like all of these vague riddles and codes and stuff like that the abbot left that ostensibly pinpoint where the gold is stashed. Now there's this stained glass window in the abbey with 4 particular saints on it. And after Peter takes like photographs of the window, like with his old school, one that you had to just take the lens off and let it sit there for like 30 seconds or whatever. One of the old school cameras. So he takes these really nice photographs of it. And he's able to figure out a bunch of clues by looking at the negatives or whatever, including this one like coded message in Latin that was etched onto the window, but then was later painted over. So the long and short of it is that the gold is supposedly hidden deep in this culvert in the churchyard, behind a quote-unquote stone with 7 eyes. Now, the abbot's writings warn that there is also a guardian watching over the treasure. But Justin and Peter naturally do not believe this. It's like, why would there be any risk in looking for some loot that was hidden by a dude that's been dead for like 4 centuries? You know what I mean? It's fine. So one night, Justin sneaks down into the culvert under cover of darkness, and he breaks open the iron gate, and he creeps on into the culvert, taking care to avoid the occasional slug inching along the wall, which is a little bit of foreshadowing. Now, not surprisingly, Justin finds the described stone with 7 eyes and pries that sucker off. And indeed, there is a big bag of what feels like coins in the hole behind the stone. But just as Justin goes to pull it out, he sees kind of like this brief glimpse of a man's kind of sneering face, like reflected in the water at the bottom of the culvert. And then this sort of black slug-like slime like comes oozing out at him, almost like it's sentient and is like not happy that he's, thieving these fucking coins out of here. So Justin like snatches the sack and beats feet out of there. Now, after that, we jump ahead a couple days and we see Peter showing up at Justin's place because he hasn't seen him in a couple days and he's wondering what's the deal. Now, Justin's housekeeper says Justin has locked himself in his room and slid a table in front of the door and won't come out. She also complains that there's slime all over the doorstep and the stairs leading up to Justin's room. She says she cleaned it once, but the next day it was back again. Peter gets Justin to open the door, and the very clearly frightened clergyman tells him that he's been stalked by something of quote-unquote darkness and slime since he stole the treasure. Then there's a slightly confusing bit, and please, if anybody else has seen this, maybe you can clarify. Because Justin says the bag didn't have anything in it but worthless metals. He's like, just as I suspected, the alchemist, he couldn't really turn anything into gold, so it's just like this bag of like a bunch of crap that's not worth anything, you know what I mean? But then when Peter looks into the sack, it looks like a bunch of gold coins to me. I mean, they're kind of dusty and dull looking, but gold nonetheless, right? Peter even gives Justin like a side eye kind of look, like he's saying, worthless metal? Okay, old man. Like he kind of gives him a look like that. In fact, I thought that Peter was going to go along with Justin's pronouncement, oh yeah, totally worthless, blah, 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 and then keep the gold for himself. And I really thought that, especially after Justin pleads with him, please go back and to the culvert and put the bag back so the blob will stop tormenting me, you know what I mean? But that's not what happens, so I admit I was kind of confused. So like I said, if you've seen this, is that really gold in there? Because it looked like gold to me. So Peter goes back in the daytime because Justin says it's probably safe in the daytime because the slime monster, I guess, was a thing of darkness, so he could only come out at night, I'm assuming. So Peter goes back in the daytime and puts the sack of gold or whatever, like back where it belongs. So Justin, very relieved, and he finally comes out of his room thinking everything's like been fixed, you know. He's still recovering from the shock though. So he's kind of like confined to a wheelchair, I guess temporarily. So he's in the courtyard in the wheelchair, like talking to Lady Datterling and Peter and like one other woman who I don't remember who it is. And then after a time, like everybody just kind of wanders off and they leave him sitting there alone in his wheelchair, like out in this courtyard, which kind of seems like a dick move, but whatever. But then after a few minutes, this man in like a monk outfit starts to approach, and he's clearly intent upon something. Now, this is the same monk-like figure who's kind of been hovering around the edges of the story the entire time. And I'm guessing he's implied to be the ghost of Abbot Thomas, right? So the monk comes like right up on Justin before Justin realizes he's in trouble. And then Justin makes this kind of like, oh shit face, you know what I mean? And then the whole thing cuts to black. So it seems like, just as in the previous Warning to the Curious story, that even putting something back that you stole does not release you from the curse. You're still fucking doomed. So again, this was another very solid adaptation. Even though Peter wasn't in the original story, I thought he was a good addition. I liked the team up of the younger man and his older mentor, like trying to solve this medieval mystery. And I liked all the stuff with the codes and them figuring it out and stuff like that. I like that kind of, you know, solving puzzles in stories. I didn't even mind the whole seance bit, though I do kind of wish that it had been tied into the main story a little bit more instead of just seeming like another, just kind of a random addition. But overall, this was another really good installment. So The Ash Tree from 1975. This was based on another 1904 story by M.R. James. This was actually the last of the M.R. James adaptations in the series. And the director, Clark, has gone on record saying he was kind of disappointed with how this one turned out. Now, the adaptation is similar to the original story, though it's kind of structured differently. The source story begins in the 17th century and then moves on to the 18th century. The TV version actually starts with the 18th century and then tells the rest in flashbacks and visions. So it's 1735, and we're following this aristocrat named Sir Richard, and he's just inherited his family estate, Castringham Hall in Suffolk, after the death of his uncle. So his uncle died with no heirs, as did his uncle's uncle before him. And Sir Richard, it seems, is kind of looking to buck this trend of having no heirs because he's already become engaged to a woman named Lady Augusta. And, you know, she will hopefully give him a son or whatever. Lady Augusta, by the way, is played by Lalla Ward, who is kind of best known for her run on Doctor Who from 1979 to 1981, and also for being married to both Tom Baker and Richard Dawkins, not at the same time, obviously. In the original story, you know, this succession was of uncles in the TV version. In the original story, it's sons, but it doesn't really make any difference to the plot. So Sir Richard seems to settle in just fine at first at his ancestral home. But before long, he starts like spacing out at inopportune times and kind of envisioning himself back in the past, like in the role of his own ancestor. So back in 1690, his uncle, Sir Matthew, was instrumental in the execution of a local woman named Anne Mothersole, who was suspected of being a witch. Now, it seems like the townsfolk back then were kind of inclined to be lenient toward her because of her social status. But Sir Matthew kind of, I guess because he was powerful and he kind of gave the vote that we're going to do this. Like, because he did testify with some obvious reluctance that he had actually seen Anne in the ash tree outside of his bedroom window, and she was only wearing a nightgown, and she was like clipping branches off the tree like that she was going to use for witchcraft, because ash tree is very witchcrafty, you know what I mean? That's used in a lot of spells and stuff. And he also stated to the authorities that when she ran off, it seemed like she disappeared and turned into a hare. Although he does admit that he's not entirely certain that she actually shapeshifted, but that's what it looked like. So Anne Mothersole gets taken to the gallows and hanged, you know what I mean? So she's cursing Sir Matthew in particular, you know, understandably so, because he's the one that got her ass hanged, right? And then she gets buried in the unhallowed ground on the losers and heathens side of the churchyard. Now, not long after this, Sir Matthew is found dead in his bed, and his skin is like all blackened and crispy, like he's been poisoned, although nobody can figure out exactly what killed him. Now, back in 1735, Sir Richard is kind of becoming increasingly troubled by these visions of the past, as well as these sort of weird scratching noises that are coming from the tree. And sometimes he hears something that kind of sounds like babies crying. So him and the vicar, when they're out walking one day, they even see something scuttling around in the tree that they think might be a squirrel, even though they're not sure because it's kind of funny looking. So Sir Richard actually isn't a big fan of this spooky tree, and neither is the vicar. So Sir Richard says, I'm going to cut that shit down. That doesn't need to be there. Another project that Sir Richard is working on, incidentally, is an expansion to the local church. And supposedly it's to make room for a special pew for his soon-to-be wife. I don't know why she's thin. It's not like she needs like a whole big pew for her big fat ass or anything like that. But it's just, I don't know. I guess that was the thing that the aristocrats did or whatever. So he's wanting to expand the church. The only problem is that this expansion will actually necessitate digging up Anne Mothersoul's grave and moving her body elsewhere. Now, the church actually has no objection to this since they thought she was a witch anyways, so they give an all clear to the exhumation. However, the night after Sir Richard kind of says that his intention to get rid of the ash tree, the same thing happens to him that happened to his ancestor, Sir Matthew. Like, the housekeeper kind of comes into his room, like, hears strange noises in there or something, and finds him, dead as the dodo in there. Like, and he has this look on his face of just, like, pure terror, and his hands are all like that. She also sees a bunch of creepy little creatures, which to me kind of looked like huge spiders with baby heads for bodies, which is a pretty fucked up image, really, no matter how you slice it. So she sees these like scurrying out the window and like back into the ash tree. So this woman is obviously horrified by this, and she flings her lantern like out the window and into the branches of the tree and burns it to the ground while the little baby head spiders are just screeching and squalling. And it's pretty horrific, actually. The following day, workmen are kind of raking through the remains of the ash tree and find, to their horror, this skeleton or like mummified corpse kind of thing with this big vagina slit type situation. It kind of reminded me of like a Sheila Nagig, if you know what that is, now that I'm thinking about it. Now, simultaneously, workmen doing the exhumation of Anne Mothersoul's grave over at the churchyard find that her coffin is empty. So that suggests that Anne's dead body, which is what this weird Sheila Nagig thing, looking thing was, has been giving birth to these spiderhead baby abominations in the ash tree, and that these things act as like architects of her revenge, like from beyond the grave. So yeah, this was another fairly good adaptation of the story. I can see why Clark felt like it wasn't as good as the others he directed. But I will say, like, the acting is impeccable. The atmosphere is really eerie. I will admit that viewers who haven't read the original story might find it a little bit hard to follow just because of the changes to its narrative structure and the fact that both Sir Richard and Sir Matthew are played by the same actor, and they don't look different enough to immediately clue you in as to like what era you're in. Like, is this Sir Matthew? Is this Sir Richard? Am I in the past? Am I in the present? You know what I mean? So it's that kind of thing. But all in all, this one was pretty decent. And the baby head spiders were surprisingly effective and pretty disturbing, like for something that's this age, you know what I mean? Like, I think that's probably the most horrific image in the whole thing. I think it's been a while since I read the original story. I'm pretty sure that in the original story, the things were just spiders. I don't remember if they had baby heads for bodies, but if they just added that for the TV thing, then that was a good change, because that was some freaky looking shit. So, The Signalman from 1976. In my opinion, this is easily the best installment of the series. Now, this was one of only 3 in the original run that was not based on an M.R. James story. This one was actually based on the Charles Dickens story from 1866, which is a classic, which is actually called The Signal Man with like a dash in the middle, whereas the TV one is all one word. The story, the original Dickens story, was actually inspired by Dickens' own experience as a passenger in the quite horrific Staplehurst train derailment of 1865, which was like a year before this story came out. This has actually always been one of my very favorite ghost stories, like of all time, and this adaptation more than does it justice. So we meet a man known only as the Traveler, and he's walking on a ridge, like near a railway tunnel, when he kind of feels compelled to call down to the signalman who he sees like near the tracks below. Now, at first, the signalman just kind of stares at him, like not really answering his call and like behaving very strangely. But finally, after the traveler asks, hey, if there's a path, can I come down to like talk to you or whatever? And then the signalman finally just gestures toward this path over there so the traveler can come down and speak to him. Now, the signalman is still acting oddly, though. And as the traveler talks to him, it's pretty clear that the signalman is like afraid of him for some reason. Now, the traveler assures him, hey, there's nothing to be afraid of or nothing like that. And the signalman like finally, starts to relax a little bit. So he eventually invites the traveler into this little signal box, little shack thing that he works in for kind of a cup of tea and a chat. So over the course of the discussions, the signalman tells the traveler, it's like, oh, my job isn't really that difficult, but, I just sort of ended up here because I slacked off my studies or whatever, something to that effect. Now, the traveler tells him, he's like, even though there isn't really much to the job, as you say, it's still like hugely important and a whole bunch of lives depend on you doing it right. So, don't beat yourself up. You know what I mean? So the signalman actually seems to appreciate this. And he actually states, he's like, I've been here for a long time and I'm actually quite content with the job and I'm really bound to do my duty as best as I can. Even though he admits that it's a very lonely kind of isolating job because he's out here by himself like pretty much all the time. So as they're talking, the traveler makes kind of a comment that, oh man, what would be the worst would be like a tunnel accident. That would be like a total nightmare. And the signalman actually concedes that this is indeed the case. And he describes like the scenario as though he's had firsthand experience. Now, while they're talking, the traveler notices that the signalman keeps kind of nervously looking over at the signal bell, even though the traveler never hears it ring. So he thinks he's acting a little weird. So he's like, are you okay? Like, are you bothered about something? If you want to talk about it or something. But the signalman is kind of reluctant. He's like, no, it's fine. So the traveler, like after a while, he's like, okay, I'm going to go back to my inn or whatever. So good night. But he's like, I'll be back to visit tomorrow night if you want me to, like if you want the company. And the signalman's like, yeah, that would be nice. But he says, when you come back, like, don't call out to me. And so the traveler thinks this is kind of a weird request, but he's like, okay, I won't. So the next night, the traveler and the signalman are kind of ensconced in the little cozy signal box again. And then the signalman begins to talk about what's been bothering him. And boy, is it a doozy. So he says, when I saw you yesterday, the traveler, he explains that he's like, the hand gestures you made and the words that you said made him initially think that the traveler was this very disturbing specter that he thinks is a specter that he claims he's seen on multiple occasions. And that's why he was afraid of him at first, because he thought he was this ghost he'd been seeing. Now, this ghost, he says, is always standing by the red signal light, like at the mouth of the train tunnel. And he has one arm across his eyes and the other arm like waving violently. Now, the man always shouts something to the effect of, hello, below there, look out. He always says something like that, which is a very similar thing to what the traveler said on the first day he showed up. Again, hence why the signalman was afraid of him at first. Now, the signalman further states that the appearance of this mysterious man is always heralded by the ringing of the signal bell, but it's this weird, vibraty sort of ring that isn't at all like the regular sound that it makes. Now, the traveler obviously does not believe that this man he's been seeing is a ghost. And so he kind of gently tries to tell the signalman, oh, maybe you're just seeing things, or maybe you're just prone to suggestion because, your job is very stressful and it's very solitary. You know what I mean. The signalman, however, insists that he isn't finished with his story yet. He says, not long after seeing this supposed spirit the first time, there was a horrifying accident in this very train tunnel, which is why it was significant that the traveler asked about that. Now, the signalman actually saw the danger and went out and like waved the red flag at the engineer, like in this desperate attempt to get him to stop. But it was all to no avail. Like 2 trains actually collided in the tunnel and there were just like numerous deaths and injuries. And it was just like a horrible, horrible scene. Now, the traveler is obviously very disturbed by this, but he says, well, that could have just been a horrible, tragic coincidence. You know what I mean? Now, the signalman at this point is getting a little bit agitated and he says, again, I'm not done. I've got more to the story, so just let me finish. Now, a while back, he says, he saw this waving man again. And this time he approached him and tried to ask what the danger was. The man didn't answer, but he just kept like saying the usual stuff that he said, like, hello, below there, like, look out or whatever. Now, the signalman at this point even gets this really brief glimpse of the dude's face which is creepy as hell. And actually, it kind of looks like a screaming man's face, like made of white plaster. It almost looks like a mask, but I don't know. It's like really creepy and weird. Now, moments after this sighting, he says, a train comes roaring out of the tunnel, like narrowly missing him. And because he'd been standing on the track, like trying to talk to this ghost. And as the train passes, this woman in a wedding dress is like leaning out like too far, like out of the window. And she actually falls out. She falls out of the train and like falls to her death, like on the ground, like right below the signal box. Now, upon hearing this, the traveler seems a little bit more rattled, especially after the signalman says, oh, and we brought the woman's body in here and laid it out right here on the floor, like right where we're sitting. You know what I mean? He's like, ew, you know, it's like that kind of situation. But the traveler, he's still attempting to find a rational explanation. But for the third time, the signalman says, there's even more to the story. I'm still not done. So he says that he's been hearing the bell and seeing the man off and on, like for the last little while. And he's starting to kind of fall into despair because he doesn't know like what the ghost wants him to do. He's like, I don't know when or from where the danger is going to come. And I really don't have any way of preventing it if indeed that is what the ghost wants me to do. He's like, even if I did report some nebulous danger just based on me seeing this supposed ghost, like his superiors wouldn't believe him because they'd be like, well, how do you know that? And he's just like, a ghost told me, you know what I mean? It's like, they'll think I'm crazy and they'll can me, you know what I mean? So the signalman is like lamenting. He's like, this ghost, it's like, I wish he would just tell me like he wanted me to do what he wanted me to do, or if he would just bother someone who actually had the power to do something or prevent whatever was going to happen. So the traveler kind of tries to reassure him by saying, you know, all you can do is fulfill your duties to the best of your abilities and don't beat yourself up like trying to interpret the actions of this purported supernatural being, right? So this seems to make the signalman feel better. And he's like, yeah, maybe I should just concentrate on doing my job right and not worry so much about stuff I can't control. Now, the next day, the traveler is again walking to the railway line to visit his friend. But on the way there, he hears a weird vibrating ring, just like the one the signalman described before, which actually the traveler has never heard before. Now, he immediately knows that that is not right. And he's like, something is terribly is the matter. So he breaks into a run, like toward the railway line. Now, meanwhile, the signalman has kind of been drawn out of his signal box by the same ring, the ghostly ring. And he sees the apparition by the red tunnel light. So he goes and he's standing on the track and he's pleading with the ghost, like, please tell me where the danger is and what I need to do to stop it. But the ghost doesn't say anything and he just shows him this like horrible face that he has. Now, the signalman is so distracted by the ghost that he fails to notice a train bearing down on him through the tunnel, like even though it was blowing its whistle and everything like that. And the engine runs him down, like while the traveler like watches in horror from the ridge above, because obviously it was too late to save him. So after the train stops, the crew members kind of pick up the signalman's surprisingly intact corpse, especially after getting hit by a train. They kind of pick him up from the tracks. And the engineer says to the traveler, he's like, I don't understand like why the signalman didn't move. He's like, he was always so careful and conscientious before. He would never have done anything like this. And then the engineer says that as soon as he saw that the signalman wasn't responding to the whistle that he was blowing, he started shouting and waving his arms to get him to move off the tracks. Now, the traveler, who is obviously like filled with dread at this point, he's like, well, can you demonstrate what it was that you were doing? And as you might have guessed, the engineer does the exact same hand movements and says the exact same words as the ghost always did. Now, the traveler simply stares at him after this with a look on his face like all his blood just turned to ice. You know what I mean? I admit I legit got goosebumps from seeing that expression. So this one was great. This was a really, really spooky, really atmospheric, really eerie, had excellent performances by the two leads. The imagery of the ghost was also like really, really unsettling, very effective. Especially, you know, the weird stone face with that screaming mouth, but even like the shots of him like from a distance where you can just kind of barely see this figure and he's got his hand doing like that. And it's just like, it's just really freaky. I can't even explain like why it's so scary, but it is. There were actually a couple of slight changes from the source story. Like in the TV version, the Traveler actually has some nightmares, like, after the signalman starts telling him about the creepy shit, which doesn't happen in the original story. In the original story, the woman in the wedding dress just died in the train. She didn't actually like fall out the window. Like everybody didn't see her falling out the window. I guess they just made that more dramatic for the TV version. And another thing that they made more dramatic was that in the original story, the Traveler doesn't see the signalman die. You know what I mean? He doesn't see it firsthand. He actually just hears about it the next day, like somebody else tells him. So again, they did that, just small changes to make it more dramatic, which is totally understandable. But other than that, this was a very, very faithful adaptation to the story and really a perfectly executed one. And I think this is rightly considered by many people to be the best one of the series, and I agree with that. So Stigma from 1977. This is actually the shortest of the series. It's only 31 minutes long. And this was also the last one to be directed by Lawrence Gordon Clark. He actually parted ways with the production after it was decided to adapt contemporary stories going forward instead of classics. Although, interestingly, there were only 2 contemporary stories in the original run, and then it was canceled. It came back later on, but, that was... So he ended up they only did like 2 contemporary stories. I guess people didn't like it as much. So this story, set in the then modern day of the 1970s, is actually based on an original story by Clive Exton. Now, this is less a ghost story. It's kind of more, I guess it's sort of still a ghost story, but it's kind of more like a folk horror, I think. But, it's still like pretty moody and interesting and disquieting. A lot of it is left unspoken, though. So how you feel about that, that's kind of up to you whether you're going to like it or not. So we're following a family consisting of Catherine, Peter, and their 13-year-old daughter, whose name is Verity. Now, this isn't stated explicitly, I don't think, but we're kind of led to assume that this family has recently moved out to the countryside from the city, and they've specifically moved to this place in Wiltshire that's just lousy with standing stones and other kind of pagan accoutrement. So a couple of workmen have been hired to move this big-ass rock from the yard because it supposedly like spoils the landscape or whatever. Now, the crane that the guys have brought isn't quite up to the task of like hefting this rock, but they do manage to shift it a bit. And this kind of causes this weird and possibly unnatural wind to kind of like rush out of the hole. So the guys say that they'll come back the next day with a bigger crane to finish removing the stone. Now, whatever this wind was that came out of the hole, it clearly had an effect on Catherine, the mom and wife, because she starts acting super out of it, like kind of spacey, and she starts talking with like this really flat affect. Now, the house also kind of starts to shake and distort a little bit. This might just be her perception, because I don't think anything breaks or nothing like that. Now, she snaps out of this after a few minutes, but then notices that she has blood on her hand. Now, at first, she thinks she just like cut herself because she was chopping vegetables for dinner, but then she washes her hand in the sink and there's no wound there. So then, when she goes into the bedroom to change clothes, she sees this big blood stain, like on her blouse and also on her undershirt. But when she like kind of strips them off in a panic and wipes all this blood off of her skin, there's again no wound. There's like no source for this blood to be coming from. So she then notices that the blood seems to be like leaching out of her pores kind of in various spots. And, that's a little bit alarming, like if you saw that. And she doesn't want anybody else in the family to see it. So she cleans up all the blood she can because there's some of it like all over the bathroom and stuff like that too. And then she kind of like very tightly wraps her midsection up with towels and washcloths and stuff, and then puts this big baggy dress on over the whole affair. Now, later on that evening, after Peter gets home from the office, he kind of makes this sideways comment about, oh, never trust women to open bottles. And Catherine's like, what the fuck you mean by that? You know what I mean? And he points to like a stain on her dress that he assumes is wine, right? Because they're having wine with their dinner. So she flips out, obviously, thinking it's blood. So she goes into the bathroom to check on the whole profuse bleeding situation. But, sees to her relief that there's actually no blood and the stain does indeed smell like wine, although it seems weird that she didn't remember spilling it. Now, that night, after everyone has gone to bed, Peter is startled awake by something or other, and he kind of creeps downstairs because he thought he heard something. Now, an onion, I think it's an onion, like kind of falls out of nowhere, like it fell out of the ceiling or something. And then a couple of the stove burners have been left on. And then he sees a knife that kind of moves a little bit by itself. So he's kind of unsettled by this, but he's not really sure if he's imagining it. Like, maybe there's a rational explanation, right? So he goes back to bed, but he does not notice that there's like a steady dripping sound coming from where his wife is sleeping on the other side of the bed. So the next day, he's enjoying his tea and toast in the morning, and he sees out the window that the workmen have returned with a much bigger crane to move that stone. Now, he actually becomes concerned when his wife, Catherine, doesn't come downstairs, and so he goes up to see what's wrong. Simultaneously, Verity, their daughter, is watching out the window as the workmen move the rock and uncover a skeleton lying underneath it. Now, when Peter gets to the bedroom, he sees, to his shock and horror, that Catherine's side of the bed is absolutely drenched in blood, which has been dripping onto the floor, hence the sound from earlier. So he yells for Verity, their daughter, to call an ambulance, which she does. But then he's kind of like pulling aside the sheets and the clothing and everything like that on Catherine, and he realizes that he can't tell where the blood is coming from. Now, the workmen outside, who are unaware of what's going on inside the house, they're wondering, should we call the police about the skeleton? It looks like it's been here for a long time, blah, blah, blah. And then they discover like several old knives in the grave that seem to have been placed there deliberately. And one of them is actually sticking out of the skeleton's ribcage. Meanwhile, the local doctor has heard about the shenanigans over here, and he kind of stops by and he goes up to have a gander at Catherine. So he pretty quickly twigs onto the fact that the blood is leaking through her skin somehow, but he's never seen anything like it. Now, because she's so pale and has obviously lost a great deal of blood, he tells Peter, it's like, look, we can't wait for the ambulance. Who knows how long it's going to be before they get here. So it's like, so they pick Catherine up and bundle her into the car and take off, like leaving Verity back at the house. So the workmen show Verity the skeleton and the knives because they're like, hey, 13-year-old girl, check out this cool shit. You know what I mean? And Verity, very sagely, says, oh, well, it was very common for people that were suspected of witchcraft to be buried in this kind of manner with the knives and the big rock on top of it and stuff like that. And she says, oh, I read it in a book. She says that a couple times. But it seems like she's also kind of possessed because she talks like with a really flat affect like her mom did earlier. So I don't know if I'm just reading too much into it, but yeah. Now, as she's talking, it's also revealed that she has an onion in her hand, like the one that kind of fell from the ceiling before, and she's kind of like slowly peeling it. Now, at the same time that's going on, Peter is driving to the hospital while the doctor is giving Catherine like mouth to mouth in the back seat. But after a few minutes, the doctor very wearily tells Peter, well, you might as well pull the car over, implying that Catherine is dead and there's no point now. You know what I mean? So Peter is obviously like completely distraught by this, and he just like gets out of the car and he's like wandering into a field like, oh, you know what I mean? Like freaking out. And then like the shot pulls back and it kind of reveals this whole area, which is just ringed with standing stones. Now, although this was not obvious, I'm assuming that Catherine became possessed or something by the spirit of the witch in the grave, and then sort of maybe reenacted her execution. I'm guessing that's what they were going for. I'm sure somebody more versed in like folk magic could explain the significance of the onion in particular, because I didn't really know what that was, and some of the other things in the episode. I definitely feel like there was a lot of little clues scattered about in this one that you might not pick up on if you're not real familiar with the witchcraft folklore of this area. Again, this was a pretty good episode. It's a little bit jarring after all of the 19th century settings like that we've had up to this point. But it was an intriguing kind of experimental sort of story nonetheless. It had a really uncanny vibe to it that I think was kind of heightened by its refusal to completely explain itself. And to be honest, I thought that the story was so interesting that I'd be curious to see like a more fleshed out version of this, like a full length film rather than just like a half-hour short film. And, where they filled in a few more of the blanks. But yeah, I think this was, for the first contemporary story that they did, this was like a pretty decent watch. So The Ice House from 1978. So this was the last installment in the original series, and it's generally considered the weakest of the bunch. I liked it well enough, but I can sort of understand why that is. So this one was directed by Derek Lister and based on an original teleplay by John Bowen. Now, the story actually has a really intriguing setup and is very unsettling, like the whole vibe of it, but it kind of doesn't really come together into a real coherent narrative, I think is the main problem I had with it. And I'm going to say that although I'm usually a big advocate of kind of cultivating ambiguity in your stories and leaving some questions unanswered, I kind of feel like the ice house maybe erred too far on the side of being kind of inscrutable or not really explaining itself, and just kind of ended up making not much sense, and it's not even really a ghost story on top of all that. So our main character is Paul, who is a middle-aged man who has come to this kind of remote health spa kind of situation to recover after his wife took off and left him. So the place is run by a pair of very obviously creepy siblings whose names are Jessica and Clovis. Now, fair play to these two. I mean, their performances, these two actors, are pretty skin crawling. Even though it's never quite revealed like what their exact deal is, they come across as really sinister, even though they're both like nice as pie on the surface. So the story starts out with Paul getting a massage from a young man named Bob, who always has cold hands, and he's constantly apologizing for that. He keeps calling it a touch of the cools, which probably should have been the title of the story for like as often as it's repeated throughout. I was just kind of like, okay, we get it. Now later on, Bob kind of seems nervous at one session and asks Paul to help him get away from the spa, but he clams up like as soon as Clovis walks into the room. Now, Bob disappears shortly thereafter, but the siblings say, oh, he just quit, he didn't like it here, and he might even come back someday. Now, the siblings are also very keen to show Paul their ice house, which if you didn't know what that is, it's this kind of just stone structure where people obviously kept ice back in the days before refrigeration and home freezers were a thing. So they want to show him that, and they also want to show him this beautiful flowering vine, which is growing on the outside of the ice house. Now, the two flowers on the vine are kind of the like trumpet variety sort of flowers. And one of the blooms is red and one of them is white, which correspond to the colors that the human siblings are always wearing. Now, Jessica also reveals that these flowers are likewise siblings, just like her and Clovis are, that the plant is very hardy, like has lived a long time, and that the scent of the blossoms is very pleasant and quote unquote overpowering. So Paul starts to get kind of more and more weirded out, like the longer he stays at this place. Now, there are other residents, like staying here, but they're all quite elderly, and they act kind of weird. Like they either don't talk very much or don't talk at all. Like there's one woman in particular who every now and then will start whimpering and shaking periodically for no obvious reason. And she sometimes even like spaces out as though she's catatonic. Like you can kind of just push her over and she's just kind of like, okay, you know what I mean? It's like really weird. But then she'll be like completely normal again a couple minutes later. Paul also notices that Jessica and Clovis seem to be overly concerned with his care and comfort, while apparently not really paying any attention to any of the other guests. Now, when he brings this up, Jessica explains, oh, well, this is just because you're our newest resident, and also you don't see all the stuff that we do for the others. Paul isn't so sure about this, though. So at the siblings' urging, Paul actually goes to smell the flowers on the ice house at night, and he appears to be kind of entranced, I guess, by their smell. There's also this really bizarre scene where the siblings are kind of enthusiastically like making out beneath the vine where the flowers are. So, you know, add incest to the list of sketchy shit that this pair is up to. Now, Paul also becomes obsessed with the ice house, thinking something nefarious might be in there. But the siblings, they actually encourage him. It's like, hey, if you're scared, why don't you go take a look? You know, it's like, we're not stopping you. But he's always like reluctant to. I mean, presumably because he's afraid of what he'll find in there. Now, the one time he does go and try the door, it's locked. But when he tells Jessica this later, she says, no, that door is never locked. She's like, and there's nothing in the ice house except ice anyway. This is another proclamation that is repeated numerous times throughout this story. Now, at last, Paul musters up enough intestinal fortitude to enter the ice house. Now, he kind of like searches for a light switch or whatever, but there isn't one. So he uses a match that he has to make this little torch out of a letter from his wife, which is a detail that's kind of treated as significant, but it's never really elaborated upon. Now, inside the ice house, he sees a person, I'm pretty sure it's Bob, frozen in a block of ice. Now, there appear to be like other blocks of ice like standing upright against the walls, and they're kind of covered by fabric. But Paul is like too freaked out to investigate any further, and he books it out of there. Now, without initially telling Clovis and Jessica what he saw, he says he wants to leave the spa. Now, the siblings have no objection to this, and they're like, okay, well, we'll get your bill ready. We're sorry we couldn't do anything for you, blah, 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 and you can leave in the morning. So they put him to bed and bring him some tea and toast and stuff like that to kind of recover from whatever his shock was. Now, at this point, he kind of seems like he's starting to have doubts about what he saw in the ice house, especially after Jessica very mildly tells him again, look, there's nothing in there except ice. And she says, as a matter of fact, if it will make you feel better, I'll take you there myself and I'll show you what's in there, like before you leave tomorrow. So he agrees with this. And like I said, he's clearly starting to doubt his own sanity at this point. The following morning, Jessica takes Paul to the ice house, just as she promised. And just as she said, there's nothing but regular ass ice in there. Yes, the ice is covered with fabric like he saw, but it's all lying on the floor in big chunks. It's not like standing upright. And there aren't any bodies like frozen in any of the chunks. And then what's weirder is that Jessica comes in and turns on an electric light with a switch. And this was a place where Paul felt along the wall before and there was no light switch there. So now he's completely certain that he must have been hallucinating. He must have dreamed the whole thing. So Paul's like, well, obviously this spa retreat is like not working yet. So I'll cancel my cancellation. I clearly need to stay on more here for some more relaxation. So it's then revealed via this kind of short monologue by Jessica that the siblings don't approve of death. That's the word that they use. And thus are kind of determined to circumvent it somehow. And then after Paul hears her saying this, he seems to kind of like accept whatever fate. And he walks into the ice house like he's ushered in by, I think, is Bob, who's like still alive. And he kind of ushers him in there. And then Paul walks into the ice house and closes the door behind him. And that's the end. So I guess there are a lot of like possible interpretations of the story, but I don't, in my opinion, at least, I don't think any of them seem to fit with all the details as they're presented. Like it's very clear at first, like that Jessica and Clovis are related to the flowering vine somehow, but I didn't really get a good sense of what their connection to the plant was and what the plant had to do with the ice house specifically. So I'm guessing that these two are like freezing people in the ice house to keep them alive indefinitely, which I guess is kind of a similar premise to the H.P. Lovecraft story, Cool Air, perhaps. But if that's the case, I mean, why did Paul see the bobsicle at first when he went in there, but then not see anything but ice when he went in there with Jessica later on? And then I was thinking, well, is everybody in the spa like already dead, or did they bring them back from the dead? Or is this some kind of purgatory or something like that? And like, why was such a big deal made about Paul burning the letter from his wife? Like when he made the little torch, I didn't really get like what the significance of that was. I honestly thought at first that Paul had actually killed his wife and this was some kind of weird judgment or something. Or it was all happening in his head or something like before he died or something like that. But that doesn't really make much sense either. I read a couple other reviews of this and like it seemed like some reviewers have also commented on the excessive number of massages that Paul gets from male masseuses. And some people have speculated that perhaps it's implied that Paul is closeted and hence that's the reason why his wife left him. Now, I can actually see that being the case. Like, it's not, I don't think that's reaching. But then again, even if the character was supposed to be coded gay, it doesn't really have anything thematically to do with what happens to him in the story, at least as far as I can discern. So yeah, I mean, this one was a little bit befuddling and a little bit disjointed, but it did have like a very, like a pleasantly disquieting kind of aura to it that I quite enjoyed. I feel like if the lore of the story had been laid out a little bit more clearly and was more like thematically linked, this could have actually been great because it had like some real spooky atmosphere to it. But as it was, it kind of came across as like mildly spooky, but overall just kind of confusing. All right, so I know I said that there were only 8 episodes in the original run, which is the case. However, I am going to do this here bonus episode, which is Whistle and I'll Come to You from 1968. Now, this short film was technically, as I said, not part of the Ghost Story for Christmas series. It actually later became kind of retroactively associated with it and is bundled with it on various DVD releases and stuff like that because it was also adapted from an M.R. James story and was also like a direct influence on the creation of A Ghost Story for Christmas, because it predated it by 3 years, I guess. And so like that was so successful that they're like, okay, well, we should make that an annual thing. So like I said, this is usually considered part of the series, even though technically it wasn't at the start. So this actually first aired as an episode of the documentary series Omnibus, which is kind of odd because obviously it's not a documentary, it's a fictional story. And it's, as far as I know, it's the only time that they did that. Now, the only differences that this has with the later Ghost Story for Christmas films was that it was in black and white. All the other ones were in color. And kind of has like a short narration at the beginning, which gives like a brief bio of M.R. James, which the other ones did not have. As most readers will probably know, this is an adaptation of what is probably M.R. James' most beloved story, which is 1904's "O Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad." So this 42-minute film is generally considered one of the best TV ghost stories of the era, and I would tend to agree. Although I will admit that the adaptation is significantly toned down from the original story, and it leaves out like a bunch of creepy incidents that actually might have been cool to show. The main character is also quite a bit older in the film than he was in the source material, but that honestly didn't really make much difference as far as that goes. So Professor Parkins is kind of a doddering, sort of punctilious academic. And he's come to this unnamed English coastal village for a bit of R&R. Now, in the original story, he specifically comes there like on a golfing holiday. But in the TV version, he specifically says that he does not play golf, and he mostly just kind of seems to want to poke around the place. Now, there are some subtle oddities, like as soon as he arrives. Like, the servants just kind of like look at him for long periods without saying anything or without answering any summons that he makes or anything like that. They kind of make him sit. It almost kind of looks like he's sitting at the kids' table, like at Thanksgiving, you know what I mean? They put him like way down at the end, like are the other guests, and they like serve him last at dinner, like after everybody's already started eating, and they're like kind of looking at him like, you know what I mean? Like he's like, it's the Mean Girls, and he's just like, it's just really weird. So it's like that whole kind of thing. Now his room also has 2 beds in it, which is something that will play into the narrative later on. Now Parkins himself doesn't seem entirely put out about any of this. But he is a bit of a strange character. He has kind of a tendency to mumble to himself and repeat back like what other people have said to him. And that has suggested to some viewers over the years that he's meant to be suffering from some kind of mental illness. But to me, he just kind of came across as a dude who was like so often inside his own head and so absorbed with his own thoughts and his own intellectual pursuits that he kind of tended to forget that other people existed. So it was always kind of like, oh, it's another person that I have to talk to. You know what I mean? So I didn't see it as like mental illness, as just kind of like an absent-minded professor type of deal. Now, shortly after arriving, he decides to go on a bit of a trudge and ends up browsing through this old cemetery. Now, in the original story, he's actually encouraged by a colleague to go to this place specifically and explore. But in the adaptation, he just finds this cemetery while he's wandering around. Now, Parkins finds a bronze whistle sticking out of a cliff face near this old grave. Now, the whistle in the story, in the original story, was actually in a hole in a wall in like an old Templar preceptory. But here it's just in the ground, like sticking out of a grave. So kind of curious about this, he puts the whistle in his pocket and starts heading off toward home. But notably, he sees a figure standing on the beach like some distance away, as though it's watching him. Now, when he gets back to the inn, he cleans out the inside of the whistle because it's got like all dirt packed in there. And he kind of scrapes the dirt onto a piece of paper. Now, in the original story, he actually throws the dirt out the window of his room and he sees the figure again. But that does not happen in the TV version. Now, the whistle has an inscription on it in Latin. And please excuse me if I pronounce this horribly wrong because I never took Latin. But the inscription says, "Quis est ista qui venit," which the professor translates to, "Who is this who is coming?" Now, in the source story, the whistle actually has a second inscription, the meaning of which actually isn't given in the story itself, but has been later roughly translated as, "Thief, you shall blow, you shall weep." Now, this second inscription does not appear on the whistle in the TV version, which probably explains why Parkins, who probably just thinks this whole entire thing is a lark, blows the whistle. Now, moments after he does this, a very strange windstorm kind of whips up outside. In the original story, he also has like a weird vision of the figure that he's been seeing, but that doesn't happen until later in the film version. He does hear creepy noises in his room, though. Now, the next morning, over breakfast, Parkins has a discussion with another guest, who I think in the film version is only known as Colonel. He's actually a much more significant character in the original story and is actually named Colonel Wilson. So the Colonel asks Parkins, seemingly apropos of nothing, if he believes in ghosts. And Parkins goes off on this very pedantic but kind of amusing digression about like the nature of death and whether we can even define what we mean by ghost or anything like that. He's clearly very pleased with his own cleverness in this discussion. He's kind of like smiling to himself with this very satisfied smirk. Now that night, he has what seems to be a nightmare of seeing this figure on the beach and then being pursued by this kind of ambulatory piece of gauzy fabric that vaguely resembles a person. This dream sequence is really good. It's really eerie and it's very effective, and it corresponds really well with the description in the original story. Now, the following day, he's returning to his room after breakfast, and then the maids ask him, well, which bed do you want us to make up? Because remember how I said that his room had 2 beds in it? And he actually has no idea what they're talking about because he's like, I've only used the one bed like the whole time I've been here. Now, they tell him that both beds look like they've been slept in. And when Parkins goes in the room, he sees that they're right. Like both beds are all like messed up. Now, he's kind of curious about this, but he's seemingly not overly troubled. He's just like, oh, maybe I messed it up when I was unpacking, or maybe I sleptwalked or something like that. Like he doesn't really think there's anything to it and just thinks there's probably a rational explanation. Now, in the original story, Parkins and the Colonel go to play golf at this point, and when they're coming back to the inn, they meet this terrified boy, like on the road, who tells them that that he just saw this spooky white figure, like waving at him from an upstairs window of the inn, the same window that corresponds to Parkins' room. Now, Parkins and the Colonel go to investigate and find the room is locked as usual, but the covers on the other bed in the room are all askew, even though the maids, like, obviously made both beds, like, earlier, and no one has been in the room since then. Now, this incident was not in the film version, but in my opinion, it absolutely should have been. Now, that night, after kind of looking through a book on spiritualism, so it's kind of clear that he's beginning to think maybe something supernatural is going on, Parkins starts hearing kind of rustling sounds in the dark, coming from the other bed, like on the other side of the room. Now, he's obviously pretty freaked out by this, and he sits up and glances over there, only to see the sheets on that bed kind of rising and like twisting of their own accord. They're kind of fashioning themselves into like the rough shape of a person. So Parkins kind of whimpers and starts sucking his thumb, which I thought was a little weird. And, you know, because he just can't believe what he's seeing, and I guess he's like regressing or whatever. Now, the Colonel actually hears his distress and like comes to help him, but it isn't real clear in the film if the Colonel saw the apparition or not. So he just comes in, and then Parkins is just kind of slumping down on his own bed, and he just goes, oh no, like that. And then that's the end. Now, this was an okay ending, but for my money, the one in the original story, though similar, was much scarier and had like a lot more threat to it. Now, just as in the movie, in the original story, Parkins kind of glances over and sees the sheets like forming themselves into a figure. But in the story, Parkins jumps out of the bed, at which point the figure starts groping around the room, like it can't really see. And it's like groping around the room, and it's like feels the bed where Parkins was just sitting, as though it's looking for him, like, you know, and who knows what it was going to do. So Parkins actually gets like a horrified glimpse of the thing's face, which he just says is made of like quote unquote crumpled linen. And then the thing sort of forces him toward the window, where Parkins almost kind of like falls halfway out, you know, when it's like it's trying to push him out the window. The Colonel then busts into the room, and the apparition like collapses back into like a heap of sheets on the floor. But it's implied that the Colonel did see the spirit, because he throws the whistle into the sea the next day, and then he has the maids like burn the sheets that the ghost had formed itself from. So as I said, this was actually an excellent adaptation of the story. The character of Parkins, even though he's different from the one in the original, was really interesting to watch, and the subtle buildup I thought was really well executed. I also felt like the effects on the fabric ghost were really beautifully done. Came across very, very chilling, and like I said, that's exactly what I pictured like in my head when I read the story. Like they did a good job of that. That said, I think that the movie was maybe a little bit too restrained, a little bit too low key. It might have benefited from showing a couple more of the scary incidents from the original story, like bumping up the ending to make it more like that and adding in the thing with the boy seeing the thing in the window and all this other kind of stuff, because I think that would have made it creepier. But man, if you're into like old school British ghost stories, you really can't go wrong with this one. I mean, the original story and this adaptation are considered classics for a reason. And that will do it for this very, very long Christmas video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Again, all of these are currently on Shudder as of Christmas 2024, so if you're curious, please go and check them out. And as always, thank you very much for stopping by the salon. Please remember, like, share, subscribe, and comment, and I will see you guys again on the next one. Happy holidays!